September 2nd, 31 BC. The western coast of Greece. The largest naval battle in ancient history is about to begin. On one side, Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the richest woman in the world, commanding a fleet of massive warships covered in gold and purple. Beside her, Mark Antony, one of Rome's greatest generals, leading hundreds of the most powerful vessels ever built. Together, they command over 500 warships and believe themselves invincible. On the other side, Octavian, Caesar's heir, the future Augustus, with a fleet of smaller, lighter ships that seem laughably outmatched. But Octavian has something his enemies don't. Not bigger ships. Not more soldiers. Something deadlier. A naval commander whose tactical genius will change warfare forever. And a secret weapon disguised as weakness, ships so small and fast they can do the impossible. In the next 6 hours, the fate of the ancient world will be decided. An empire will fall. A dynasty will end. And Cleopatra will watch her dreams burn on the water. If you want to discover the hidden battles that changed history, subscribe now and comment which ancient conflict I should cover next. What happens in this battle will shock you. The stage for the Battle of Actium had been set by years of political chaos in Rome. After Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, the Roman Republic descended into civil war. 3 men emerged to share power in an uneasy alliance called the Second Triumvirate: Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir; Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general; and Lepidus, who would soon be sidelined into irrelevance. The real power struggle was always between Octavian and Antony. Mark Antony was everything a Roman general was supposed to be. He was brave, charismatic, loved by his soldiers, and had proven himself in countless battles. When Caesar died, Antony seemed destined to rule Rome. But then he made a decision that would define his fate. He went to Egypt and fell in love with Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the richest and most powerful woman in the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra was not just beautiful, she was brilliant. She spoke 9 languages, was educated in mathematics, philosophy, and astronomy, and understood power politics better than most Roman senators. She had already seduced Julius Caesar, bearing him a son, and had used that relationship to secure Egypt's independence. Now she would do the same with Mark Antony. But this time, the relationship went deeper. Antony didn't just want Egypt's wealth and resources. He genuinely loved her. Their union was both romantic and strategic. Antony needed Egypt's vast treasury and grain supplies to fund his military campaigns. Cleopatra needed Rome's military might to protect her kingdom and her children's future. Together, they envisioned creating a new empire, a fusion of Roman military power and Egyptian wealth, centered in Alexandria rather than Rome. It was a magnificent dream that threatened everything Octavian represented. Octavian, back in Rome, saw his opportunity. He was younger, less experienced in battle, and not particularly charismatic. But he was a political genius who understood propaganda better than any Roman before him. He began a systematic campaign to destroy Antony's reputation. He portrayed Antony not as a Roman general but as an Egyptian puppet, bewitched by a foreign seductress, abandoning Roman values for Oriental luxury and decadence. The propaganda worked brilliantly. Octavian claimed that Antony had become un-Roman, that he wore Egyptian clothes, participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies, and planned to move Rome's capital to Alexandria. Most damaging of all, Octavian obtained Antony's will, possibly by theft, and revealed that Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra rather than in Rome. To Romans, this was the ultimate betrayal. In 32 BC, Octavian convinced the Roman Senate to declare war, not on Antony directly, which would have been civil war, but on Cleopatra. It was a clever political move. By making Cleopatra the enemy, Octavian framed the conflict as Rome versus a foreign threat rather than Roman versus Roman. Antony, standing beside Cleopatra, became a traitor by association. Both sides spent months preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Antony and Cleopatra assembled their forces in Greece, planning to invade Italy and march on Rome itself. Their fleet was magnificent, over 500 warships, including massive quinquiremes and even larger vessels, floating fortresses up to 40 meters long, powered by hundreds of rowers, carrying artillery, marines, and catapults. These ships were designed to overwhelm enemies through sheer size and firepower. Cleopatra's personal flagship was legendary, a massive vessel with purple sails, gilded stern, and a throne room from which she could command her squadron of 60 Egyptian warships. She brought Egypt's treasury with her, planning to finance the campaign and, if necessary, use the gold to bribe Octavian's supporters. The sight of her fleet must have been breathtaking. Hundreds of massive ships, their oars beating the water in synchronized rhythm, their decks crowded with soldiers. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his childhood friend and military genius Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, seemed inferior by comparison. His ships were smaller, lighter, and carried fewer soldiers. But Agrippa had studied naval warfare obsessively. He understood that battles weren't won by the biggest ships but by the best tactics. And he had developed a secret weapon that would revolutionize naval combat. As both fleets converged on the Ambracian Gulf near Actium in western Greece, the ancient world held its breath. The outcome of this battle would determine whether Rome would be ruled by Octavian or Antony, whether the capital would remain in Rome or move to Alexandria, whether the Republic's values would continue or be replaced by an Oriental monarchy. Everything came down to the battle that was about to begin. And neither Antony nor Cleopatra understood that they had already lost. Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa was the secret to Octavian's success, though history would remember his master's name far better than his own. While Octavian handled politics and propaganda, Agrippa won the actual battles. He was one of the greatest military commanders Rome ever produced, and before Actium, he had revolutionized naval warfare with a simple but devastating innovation. The traditional Roman warship was the quinquireme, a massive vessel with 5 rows of oars, capable of carrying 300 rowers and up to 120 marines. These ships fought by ramming enemies with a bronze ram mounted on the prow, or by coming alongside and allowing marines to board. It was brutal, direct warfare that favored size and numbers. Mark Antony's fleet consisted primarily of these massive ships and even larger vessels, some with 6 or 7 rows of oars. But Agrippa had studied these traditional tactics and found their weakness. Large ships were powerful but slow. They took time to maneuver. They needed skilled crews to coordinate hundreds of oars. And most critically, they were vulnerable to smaller, faster opponents who could strike and withdraw before the larger ships could respond. So Agrippa had built his fleet around a different type of ship, the Liburnian galley. These vessels originated from Illyrian pirates who had terrorized the Adriatic for generations. They were smaller, lighter, with only 2 rows of oars, carrying perhaps 100 rowers and 50 marines. Individually, they were no match for a quinquireme. But Agrippa understood something crucial. Naval battles weren't duels between individual ships. They were coordinated operations where speed, maneuverability, and tactics mattered more than size. The Liburnian galleys could accelerate quickly, turn sharply, and withdraw rapidly. More importantly, Agrippa had equipped them with a devastating weapon called the harpax, a ballista-launched grappling hook attached to a rope. When a Liburnian approached an enemy ship, it would fire the harpax, which would embed in the enemy's hull or rigging. Then the Liburnian's crew would winch the rope tight, pulling the ships together whether the enemy wanted to engage or not. This weapon transformed naval combat. Traditional ramming required precise timing and approach angles. The harpacks worked at range and didn't require ramming speed. Once embedded, it was nearly impossible to remove quickly. The enemy ship would be dragged sideways, unable to maneuver, while multiple Liburnian galleys converged on it. What had been a one-on-one duel became a coordinated swarm attack. Agrippa had another advantage: superior intelligence and positioning. 4 months before the battle, he had blockaded Antony and Cleopatra's forces in the Ambracian Gulf, cutting off their supplies. Antony's massive fleet was trapped in the Gulf, slowly starving. Disease spread through the crowded camps. Desertion rates climbed as soldiers realized the campaign was failing. Antony faced an impossible choice: stay trapped and watch his army disintegrate, or try to break through Agrippa's blockade. Antony chose to fight, but his strategy was compromised from the start. His massive ships had been sitting idle for months. Many of his best rowers had deserted or died from disease. He didn't have enough healthy men to fully crew his entire fleet, so he was forced to abandon or burn about 150 ships before the battle even began. The fleet that sailed out to meet Agrippa was already weakened. Worse, Antony faced a fundamental strategic dilemma. He could either fight a traditional naval battle, trying to ram and board Agrippa's ships, or he could attempt to break through the blockade and escape to Egypt with Cleopatra and the treasury. Fighting meant risking everything on a single engagement. Escaping meant abandoning his army and acknowledging defeat. But it would preserve his and Cleopatra's lives and the possibility of fighting another day. Cleopatra pushed for escape. She had loaded her 60 Egyptian ships with the treasury and had no intention of dying in Greece. Antony, torn between his military instincts and his love for Cleopatra, made a fatal compromise. He would try to do both. He would engage Agrippa's fleet with his heavy ships while Cleopatra's squadron waited for an opportunity to break through and escape. It was a plan that satisfied no one and would fail catastrophically. But on the morning of September 2, 31 BC, as both fleets rowed out of the Gulf into open water, Antony still believed he could win. He was about to discover how wrong he was. The morning of the Battle of Actium dawned with an oppressive heat and unusual wind conditions. Antony's fleet emerged from the Ambracian Gulf in battle formation, massive quinquiremes and larger vessels in the center, smaller ships on the flanks, and Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron of 60 ships in the rear, their purple sails immediately visible. The sight must have been magnificent. Over 350 warships, their bronze rams gleaming, their decks crowded with marines in armor, their oars beating the water in synchronized rhythm. Agrippa's fleet waited in open water. Approximately 400 ships, mostly Liburnian galleys, arranged in a crescent formation designed to envelope the enemy. To Antony's veterans, the Octavian ships looked inadequate, smaller, less impressive, carrying fewer soldiers. The Romans had always believed that naval battles were won by the side with bigger ships and more marines. Everything in Antony's experience suggested he should win this engagement. But Agrippa had no intention of fighting the battle Antony expected. As the two fleets approached each other, the Liburnian galleys didn't charge forward to ram. Instead, they maintained distance, circling, probing for weaknesses. Antony's ships, heavy and sluggish after months of inactivity, struggled to close the distance. The lighter Octavian ships simply withdrew when Antony's vessels approached, staying just out of ramming range. It was frustrating and confusing. Naval battles were supposed to be decisive clashes where ships rammed each other and marines boarded for hand-to-hand combat. But Agrippa was refusing to fight that kind of battle. He was using his ship's superior speed and maneuverability to control the engagement, striking only when and where he chose. Then Agrippa revealed his true tactics. When one of Antony's quinquiremes extended too far from the main formation, multiple Liburnian galleys converged on it from different angles. They fired their harpacks' grappling hooks from safe distance. the iron claws embedded in the larger ship's hull and rigging. The Liburnians began winching their lines tight, pulling the quinquereme sideways, preventing it from maneuvering or ramming. The crew of the trapped quinquereme tried desperately to cut the ropes or dislodge the hooks, but more Liburnian galleys were already closing in. Marines on the smaller ships fired arrows and javelins, clearing the quinquereme's deck. Then they attached more harpax lines, completely immobilizing the larger vessel. Finally, boarding parties swarmed across, overwhelming the quinquereme's marines through sheer numbers. The entire attack took perhaps 15 minutes. One of Antony's most powerful ships had been captured without Agrippa losing a single vessel. And then it happened again. And again. Agrippa's ships worked in coordinated groups of 3 or 4, isolating individual enemy vessels, immobilizing them with the harpax, and overwhelming them with concentrated force. The Liburnian galleys moved like a wolf pack, never engaging in fair fights, always attacking with numerical superiority at the point of contact even though Antony had more total ships. Antony tried to counter by tightening his formation, keeping his ships close together so they could support each other. But this made his fleet even slower and less maneuverable. The Liburnian galleys simply circled, looking for stragglers, picking off any ship that strayed too far from protection. And Antony's ships, heavy and sluggish, couldn't catch the faster Octavian vessels to force a traditional battle. The engagement descended into a grinding, frustrating stalemate. Antony's massive ships couldn't engage an enemy that refused to close for ramming. Agrippa's smaller ships couldn't easily overwhelm Antony's center while the heavy ships stayed in tight formation. The battle that should have been decided in an hour dragged on through the morning and into the afternoon with no clear victor. But Antony's position was slowly deteriorating. Every ship he lost to Agrippa's wolf-pack tactics weakened his formation. His marines were exhausting themselves in the Mediterranean heat, weighed down by armor, waiting for a decisive clash that never came. And critically, the wind was beginning to shift. Around noon, a northwesterly wind began to blow, unusual for that time of day and season. The wind favored ships with sails deployed. Most of Antony's ships had left their sails ashore to save weight and increase maneuverability. But Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron, waiting in the rear, still had their sails. They were the only ships in either fleet that could effectively use the wind. And suddenly, Cleopatra saw her opportunity. The battle was stalemated. Antony couldn't win decisively. But the wind could carry her squadron through the Octavian line and away to Egypt with the treasury intact. She could preserve the possibility of continuing the war from Alexandria. All she had to do was abandon Antony to his fate and run. So she did exactly that. And everything collapsed. Cleopatra's decision to flee would be debated by historians for 2,000 years. Was it cowardice? Was it pragmatic strategy to preserve the treasury and live to fight another day? Was it premeditated betrayal, or a desperate decision made in the chaos of battle? The truth is probably more complex than any simple narrative, but the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Around mid-afternoon, with the battle still deadlocked, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 Egyptian ships suddenly hoisted their purple sails and turned away from the engagement. The northwesterly wind filled their sails, and they accelerated toward a gap in Agrippa's crescent formation. The Egyptian ships weren't trying to fight. They were making a run for open sea and the route back to Egypt. Agrippa's commanders faced an instant decision: pursue Cleopatra's ships or continue engaging Antony's fleet. Some Liburnian galleys broke off to chase the Egyptians, but most remained focused on Antony's heavy ships. The Egyptians were faster with the wind behind them, and most escaped through the gap, their purple sails disappearing toward the southern horizon. What happened next is one of history's most tragic moments. Mark Antony, commanding from his flagship in the thick of battle, saw Cleopatra's ships fleeing. He faced an agonizing choice that had to be made instantly. Stay with his fleet and fight to the bitter end, hoping for a victory that seemed increasingly unlikely. Or follow Cleopatra, the woman he loved, abandoning his fleet and his men to pursue her. He chose Cleopatra. Antony transferred to a lighter, faster ship and sailed after the Egyptian squadron, taking only a few escort vessels with him. He left behind over 300 warships and thousands of soldiers and sailors who were still fighting in his name. The man who had been one of Rome's greatest generals abandoned his own battle to chase after a woman. The psychological impact on Antony's fleet was devastating. When word spread that both Antony and Cleopatra had fled, morale collapsed completely. Soldiers who had been willing to die for their commander suddenly realized they had been abandoned. Some ships tried to follow Antony's escape route. Others lowered their weapons and surrendered immediately. Still others fought on with desperate courage, not knowing what else to do. Agrippa's fleet moved in for the kill. The Liburnian galleys, no longer facing coordinated resistance, swarmed over the remaining ships like locusts. They used fire weapons, pots of burning pitch and oil launched by catapults, setting enemy vessels ablaze. The heavy ships that had seemed so imposing that morning became death traps, too slow to escape, too isolated to defend themselves effectively. Some of Antony's commanders fought with incredible bravery. They knew the battle was lost but refused to surrender, choosing death over the shame of capture. Their ships became floating pyres, burning on the water while their crews fought to the last man. Others tried desperately to row back to the Gulf, hoping to reach shore and escape overland. Agrippa's ships pursued them relentlessly, capturing or destroying vessel after vessel. By sunset, it was over. Antony had lost approximately 200 ships, either captured, destroyed, or burned. About 5,000 of his men were dead, with thousands more captured. Agrippa's losses were minimal, perhaps a few dozen ships damaged, casualties in the hundreds rather than thousands. It was a decisive, overwhelming victory achieved not through bigger ships or more soldiers, but through superior tactics and the devastating effectiveness of the Harpax weapon. But the human cost transcended numbers. Thousands of Roman soldiers and sailors, abandoned by their commander, died or were captured while Antony sailed away with Cleopatra. When the survivors eventually reached shore and learned that both their leaders had fled, the bitterness was overwhelming. Some committed suicide rather than face the shame. Others simply deserted, making their way home as best they could. A few remained loyal and would follow Antony to Egypt for the final chapter of the tragedy. Octavian, when news of the victory reached him, understood immediately that he had won more than a battle. He had won the civil war. Antony's fleet was destroyed. His army, still camped near Actium, would surrender within days when they learned their commander had abandoned them. The path to absolute power over Rome was now open. But Octavian wasn't satisfied with just winning. He wanted Antony dead, Cleopatra captured, and Egypt's treasury seized. The war wouldn't truly be over until the last threats to his power were eliminated. And Antony and Cleopatra, sailing toward Egypt, didn't yet realize that they weren't escaping to safety. They were sailing toward their doom. The journey back to Alexandria was a nightmare of guilt, shame, and recrimination. Antony and Cleopatra's ships sailed separately at first. He couldn't bear to face her after what he had done, and she was dealing with her own psychological collapse. When they finally met again days later, Antony was nearly catatonic with depression. He had abandoned his army, betrayed his men, and destroyed his own honor for love. The greatest Roman general of his generation had become a deserter and a failure. Cleopatra tried to salvage the situation with characteristic pragmatism. They still had the treasury. They still had Egypt's resources. They could raise new armies, bribe Octavian supporters, rebuild their fleet. The war wasn't over. They had lost a battle, not everything. But Antony barely responded. He had lost something more valuable than ships or soldiers. He had lost his sense of self. When they reached Alexandria, Cleopatra attempted to present the return as a victory, ordering celebrations and concealing the scale of the defeat. But the truth couldn't be hidden for long. Messengers began arriving with increasingly dire news. Antony's land army had surrendered to Octavian without a fight. His allies were defecting. His supporters in Rome were being arrested or killed. Provinces were declaring for Octavian. The entire eastern Mediterranean was abandoning them. Cleopatra understood political reality better than Antony. She began secret negotiations with Octavian, offering to abdicate in favor of her children, to hand over the treasury, to cooperate with Rome in exchange for her children's lives and a quiet retirement. She was trying to salvage something from the catastrophe, using the only leverage she had left. Octavian's responses were deliberately ambiguous. He sent messages suggesting he might spare Cleopatra if she killed Antony. He implied he might negotiate if she surrendered the treasury intact. He kept her hoping while his forces methodically conquered every territory between Greece and Egypt. It was psychological warfare designed to keep his enemies paralyzed while he approached. Antony, meanwhile, oscillated between depression and manic attempts to seem normal. He built a small house on a pier extending into Alexandria's harbor and withdrew from society, calling it his Timoneum after Timon of Athens, the famous misanthrope. He held banquets where he and Cleopatra pretended everything was fine, distributing gifts and making grand gestures. But everyone could see the desperation underneath. Some of Antony's remaining supporters urged him to fight one last time, to die with honor rather than surrender. Cleopatra's advisers begged her to abandon Antony and make a separate peace with Octavian. But neither could bring themselves to make the final break. They had come too far together, sacrificed too much, to separate now. In July of 30 BC, nearly a year after Actium, Octavian's forces finally reached Egypt. His army, led by capable generals, encountered minimal resistance. Egyptian garrisons surrendered without fighting. Antony's remaining forces melted away through desertion. Alexandria itself made no preparations for defense. The end was obvious to everyone except Antony and Cleopatra, who still clung to desperate hope. Antony made one last attempt to fight, leading a small cavalry force against Octavian's advance units. He won a minor skirmish and returned to Alexandria briefly triumphant, kissing Cleopatra and boasting that he could still fight. But the next day, when he led his forces out again, they simply surrendered to Octavian en masse. His own soldiers betrayed him. His fleet, what little remained, defected. He returned to Alexandria alone, abandoned by everyone. False reports reached him that Cleopatra was dead, that she had committed suicide to avoid capture. In despair, Antony stabbed himself with his sword, the Roman way to die with honor when all was lost. But the wound wasn't immediately fatal, and then he learned that Cleopatra was still alive, having locked herself in her tomb with her treasures. Antony was carried to Cleopatra's tomb, bleeding and dying. They had one final conversation through the tomb's high windows. She wouldn't open the doors for fear of Octavian's soldiers, so Antony was hauled up by ropes. He died in her arms, urging her to make peace with Octavian and survive. His last words were about her safety, not his own honor. He died as he had lived the last years of his life, for love of Cleopatra above all else. She held his body and understood that this was the end. Not just for Antony, but for Egypt, for the Ptolemaic dynasty, for 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization. Octavian was coming, and he would accept nothing less than complete surrender. And Cleopatra had no intention of surrendering. Cleopatra spent her final days as she had lived, calculating, intelligent, and determined to control her own fate. She was now 39 years old, had ruled Egypt for 21 years, had borne children to both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and had come closer than anyone to creating an empire that could rival Rome. She had played the game of power as well as any man of her era. But the game was over, and she knew it. Octavian entered Alexandria in August of 30 BC and immediately sent representatives to negotiate with Cleopatra. He needed two things from her: the treasury intact and her alive to parade in his triumph back in Rome. A foreign queen walking in chains through Roman streets would be the ultimate validation of his victory. Cleopatra understood this perfectly and refused to cooperate. She had barricaded herself in her tomb, a two-story structure where she had stored much of Egypt's remaining wealth. Octavian's soldiers surrounded it, but hesitated to assault for fear she would set fire to the treasure. Negotiations became a tense standoff. Octavian sent one of his most charming officers to meet with Cleopatra, hoping to seduce her into compliance or at least keep her from destroying the treasure. She met with him but clearly wasn't fooled. During this time, Cleopatra was conducting experiments. Ancient sources claim she tested various poisons on condemned prisoners, observing which produced the quickest, least painful death. She rejected several options before settling on the venom of the Egyptian cobra, the ASP. It was the sacred symbol of Egyptian royalty, appearing on pharaonic crowns for millennia. Death by cobra was simultaneously a political statement and a religious act. On August 10 or 12, 30 BC, ancient sources vary, Cleopatra requested permission to visit Antony's tomb to make offerings. Octavian, believing she was finally accepting her fate, granted permission. She returned to her own tomb and prepared for the end. She bathed, dressed in her royal regalia, and had a final meal sent in. Hidden in a basket of figs, according to legend, was an ASP. What happened next became one of history's most famous deaths, though the exact details remain debated. Cleopatra arranged herself on a golden couch, wearing her crown and royal robes. She allowed the cobra to bite her, probably on her arm. The venom of the Egyptian cobra causes relatively painless death through respiratory paralysis. The victim simply falls asleep and stops breathing. Two of her most loyal handmaidens, Iras and Charmian, died with her, probably from the same snake. When Octavian's soldiers broke into the tomb, they found Cleopatra dead on her couch, looking as though she had simply fallen asleep. Charmian, dying, was adjusting the crown on Cleopatra's head. When a soldier asked if this was well done, Charmian replied with her last breath, "It is well done, and fitting for a princess descended of so many royal kings." Octavian was furious. He had wanted Cleopatra alive for his triumph. He had tried snake charmers to attempt to revive her. Ancient belief held that cobra venom could be drawn out by the snakes themselves. Nothing worked. Cleopatra had won one final victory. She would never be humiliated in Rome. She had died a queen and a pharaoh, on her own terms. Octavian had her buried beside Antony with full royal honors. He killed Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, to eliminate any rival claims to Caesar's legacy. But he spared Cleopatra's other children by Antony, raising them in his own household. They were too young to be threats, and killing them would have made him look cruel. Egypt became a Roman province, personally controlled by Octavian. It would never again be independent. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled for 300 years since Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy seized control, was finished. The age of the pharaohs, stretching back 3 millennia to the Old Kingdom, was over. Rome now controlled the richest territory in the Mediterranean. Octavian returned to Rome in 29 BC and celebrated 3 triumphs, for his victories in Illyricum, at Actium, and over Egypt. He paraded images of Cleopatra in the processions, showing her suicide by snake since he couldn't parade her in person. The Roman crowds cheered wildly. The civil wars were finally over. One man ruled Rome supreme. In 27 BC, the Senate granted Octavian the title Augustus, meaning the revered one. The Roman Republic was dead. The Roman Empire was born. And it all traced back to a naval battle where smaller, faster ships had defeated a queen's massive fleet. The Battle of Actium's impact extended far beyond the immediate deaths of Antony and Cleopatra. It marked the definitive end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire, a transformation that would shape Western civilization for centuries. Augustus, as Octavian now called himself, didn't technically end the Republic. He carefully maintained the fiction that he was simply first citizen among equals. But in reality, he held absolute power. The military lesson of Actium was studied by naval commanders for generations. Agrippa had proven that ship size wasn't the primary determinant of naval victory. Maneuverability, tactics, and innovative weapons could defeat seemingly superior forces. The Liburnian galley became the standard light warship of the Roman Navy for the next 200 years. The harpax weapon, though less revolutionary than Greek fire would be centuries later, had shown how a simple innovation could transform naval combat. But Actium's deeper significance was political. It demonstrated that control of the Mediterranean required naval supremacy. Augustus invested heavily in a Roman navy, establishing permanent fleets at Ravenna and Misenum to protect Italian coasts, and at Alexandria and Caesarea to control the eastern Mediterranean. These fleets ensured that Rome's grain supplies from Egypt flowed uninterrupted, preventing the kind of food shortages that had plagued the late Republic. The propaganda war around Actium was as important as the battle itself. Augustus commissioned poets, historians, and artists to celebrate the victory. Virgil's Aeneid, the great Roman epic, contains descriptions of Actium that portray it as a cosmic struggle between Roman virtue and Eastern decadence. Horace wrote odes celebrating Augustus's victory. Monumental architecture in Rome commemorated the battle. Augustus built a massive victory monument at Actium itself, decorated with the bronze rams of captured ships. The portrayal of Cleopatra in Roman propaganda was particularly vicious and enduring. She was depicted as a seductress who had corrupted Mark Antony, turning a noble Roman general into an Eastern puppet. This narrative served Augustus's purposes perfectly. It made the civil war seem like a foreign war against Egypt rather than a conflict between Romans. And it degraded Cleopatra's genuine political and intellectual abilities, reducing her to a stereotype of the dangerous foreign woman. This propaganda was so effective that it dominated Western views of Cleopatra for 2,000 years. She became the archetype of the seductive Eastern queen, more remembered for her romantic relationships than for her political achievements. Only recently have historians begun recovering the more complex reality. Cleopatra was a capable ruler who kept Egypt independent for decades through intelligent diplomacy and strategic alliances in an era when most kingdoms were being absorbed by Rome. For Egypt, Actium was catastrophic. The country lost its independence and wouldn't regain it for nearly 2,000 years. The Ptolemaic system of government was dismantled. Egyptian grain, which had enriched the Ptolemies, now fed Rome. Egyptian gold, which had funded Cleopatra's ambitions, filled Augustus's treasury. The ancient Egyptian culture, already much diminished under Greek Ptolemaic rule, would gradually be suppressed under Roman and later Christian domination. The broader ancient world also changed. With the civil wars finally ended, Rome enjoyed relative peace for over 200 years, the famous Pax Romana. Trade flourished. Cities grew. Literature and art thrived. But this peace came at the cost of political freedom. The Senate became a rubber stamp. Dissent was dangerous. Imperial cult worship was established, requiring citizens to acknowledge the emperor's divinity. The Roman Empire brought stability and prosperity, but it was the stability of autocracy. The transformation from republic to empire raised questions that political philosophers would debate for centuries. Had the republic been doomed by its own success? Did Rome grow too large to be governed by republican institutions? Was autocracy necessary to manage an empire spanning 3 continents? Or could different leaders, making different choices at crucial moments, have preserved republican government? These questions had no easy answers. But one thing was certain: the Battle of Actium was the hinge point. If Antony and Cleopatra had won at Actium, history would have been completely different. The Roman Empire might never have formed, or it might have formed centered in Alexandria rather than Rome. Western civilization, as we know it, might have developed very differently. Instead, Augustus won. Rome became an empire. And Cleopatra's dream of an independent Egypt aligned with, but not subservient to Rome died in the waters off Actium. The naval tactics demonstrated at Actium influenced military thinking for centuries, though not always in ways modern historians might expect. The lesson that smaller, more maneuverable ships could defeat larger vessels through superior tactics should have been obvious. Yet throughout history, naval powers repeatedly had to relearn this principle, as technological advancement and political prestige drove the construction of ever larger warships. During the height of the Roman Empire, the Navy maintained Liburnian galleys as its standard light warship, but also continued building larger vessels for prestige and specific tactical roles. The balance between size and maneuverability remained a constant tension in naval design. Shipbuilders understood Agrippa's lesson intellectually, but the psychological appeal of massive warships, the visible demonstration of power and wealth, proved difficult to resist. The medieval period largely abandoned large-scale naval warfare in favor of coastal raiding and transport. But when major naval powers emerged in the Renaissance, they faced similar questions. The Spanish Armada of 1588, with its massive galleons, was defeated partly by smaller, more maneuverable English ships that could fire and withdraw before the Spanish could close for boarding. The Principal Agrippa demonstrated at Actium that mobility and tactics could trump size, applied across different technologies and eras. The age of sail saw constant evolution in warship design, with naval architects trying to balance firepower, protection, and speed. The ship of the line, massive 3-deckers carrying up to 100 guns, dominated naval warfare for 200 years. Yet even in this era, smaller frigates played crucial roles as scouts, raiders, and commerce protectors. The lesson of Actium persisted. Different ship types served different purposes, and tactical innovation mattered as much as raw size. The Industrial Revolution and the advent of steam power, ironclads, and eventually steel battleships created new dynamics but didn't fundamentally change this tension. The dreadnought battleships of the early 20th century were floating fortresses, yet they were vulnerable to torpedoes from small, fast destroyers and submarines. World War II proved definitively that aircraft carriers, which launched small, maneuverable aircraft, were more valuable than battleships. Once again, the lesson of Actium held: concentrated mobile striking power deployed intelligently beats impressive size. Modern naval warfare has largely moved away from ship-to-ship combat entirely. Missiles, submarines, and aircraft dominate contemporary strategy. Yet the fundamental principle Agrippa demonstrated remains relevant. In conflict, the side that can project force precisely while avoiding the enemy's strengths typically prevails. The Harpax weapon that allowed Liburnian galleys to immobilize larger ships has its conceptual descendants in modern precision-guided weapons that can disable larger platforms before they can effectively respond. Beyond military tactics, Actium's broader lessons about the relationship between technology, strategy, and politics remain relevant. Augustus won not just because Agrippa was a brilliant naval commander, but because Augustus understood how to combine military victory with political messaging. The battle was important, But the propaganda campaign that followed was equally crucial. Augustus didn't just defeat his enemies. He controlled the narrative about what the victory meant. This integration of military and political strategy influenced leaders for centuries. Napoleon studied Augustus's rise to power and attempted to replicate it, though with less lasting success. Modern political leaders still understand that military victories must be framed properly to translate into political capital. The messaging around conflicts often matters as much as the tactical outcomes. The personal dimension of Actium, the love story between Antony and Cleopatra, has proven even more enduring than the military lessons. Their relationship became archetypal in Western culture, the tragic romance between a powerful leader who sacrifices duty for love and the exotic foreign queen whose ambitions doom them both. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra immortalized this narrative. Countless films, novels, and plays have retold the story. But this romantic narrative, powerful as it is, obscures the harder political and military realities. Cleopatra wasn't just a seductress. She was a capable ruler making rational strategic decisions to protect her kingdom. Antony wasn't just a love-struck fool. He was a general trying to create a new political order that would have ended the civil wars through power-sharing rather than autocracy. Their plan failed not because it was inherently foolish, but because they faced an opponent in Augustus who was better at both military logistics and political propaganda. The counterfactual questions Actium raises are fascinating. What if Antony had won the battle? Would he and Cleopatra have successfully created a dual empire structure with Rome and Alexandria as twin capitals? Would such a system have been stable, or would it have eventually collapsed into renewed civil war? Would Eastern cultural influences have transformed Roman civilization differently? Would Christianity, which emerged a generation later, have spread differently in an empire centered partly in Alexandria? These questions have no definitive answers, but they illustrate how much the battle mattered. Actium was one of those rare historical moments where the outcome genuinely changed everything that followed. If the battle had gone differently, the entire trajectory of Western civilization would have been altered. The technological innovation that enabled Augustus's victory, Agrippa's use of Liburnian galleys and the harpax weapon, was significant but not revolutionary in the way that Greek fire or gunpowder would be. The Liburnian galley was an adaptation of existing technology rather than a completely new invention. The harpax was clever but not game-changing in the long term. Later naval warfare didn't particularly rely on grappling weapons. What made Actium decisive was the combination of modest technological advantage, superior tactics, better logistics, stronger political position, and the catastrophic decision by Antony and Cleopatra to flee. Remove any one of these factors, and the outcome might have been different. This multi-causal nature of the victory makes it a rich case study for military historians. Battles are rarely won by single factors, but by the combination of many advantages skillfully exploited. The human stories from Actium, beyond the famous figures of Antony, Cleopatra, and Augustus, reveal the personal costs of grand historical transformations. Thousands of ordinary soldiers and sailors fought that day, most of whose names are lost to history. Their individual experiences of the battle, the fear, the confusion, the moments of courage or panic, shaped the outcome as much as the grand strategies of generals. Consider the rowers on Antony's massive quinquiremes. These men, possibly slaves or poor freemen working for pay, spent months trapped in the Ambracian Gulf watching their comrades die from disease. They were malnourished, exhausted, and demoralized before the battle even began. When the fighting started and they saw Cleopatra's purple sails disappearing toward the horizon, what did they think? Did they feel betrayed? Did they understand they had been abandoned? Or were they simply relieved when their officers finally ordered surrender, ending the nightmare? The Marines who fought on both sides faced different horrors. They were the elite soldiers, trained for ship-to-ship combat, and they expected to prove their courage in boarding actions. But Agrippa's tactics largely denied them that opportunity. Instead of glorious hand-to-hand combat, they stood on their ship's decks being peppered with arrows and javelins, unable to close with the enemy. When harpax hooks embedded in their ships and enemy marines swarmed aboard, they fought desperately but were often overwhelmed by numbers. For professional warriors, this kind of defeat, trapped and overrun rather than meeting enemies in fair combat, must have been psychologically devastating. Agrippa's sailors and marines had their own experiences. They were winning, but victory in ancient naval combat was still terrifying. Ships burning nearby, the screams of wounded enemies, the constant risk that a lucky ram might sink your vessel, even the winning side suffered trauma. And many of Agrippa's men had friends or relatives fighting for Antony. This was a civil war, meaning Romans killing Romans, sometimes people they had served alongside in previous campaigns. The aftermath of the battle created different tragedies. Antony's soldiers who had been left behind when he fled faced impossible choices. Some tried to continue fighting, out of loyalty or simply because they didn't know what else to do. Others surrendered immediately, hoping for mercy. Still others deserted, trying to make their way home. Many of these men had followed Antony for years, had fought for him in a dozen campaigns, had believed in his cause. His abandonment must have felt like the ultimate betrayal. One story that survived in ancient sources involves a centurion who confronted Antony after he had escaped with Cleopatra. The centurion had fought his way to Antony's retreat vessel to report on the battle. When he found Antony sitting silently, seemingly broken, the centurion reportedly said, "O Antony, you trust these wretched ships? What do they mean to men who have borne their wounds in fighting for you on land?" The rebuke captured the feelings of the abandoned soldiers. They had bled for Antony, and he had left them to save his lover. Cleopatra's perspective is harder to recover because most sources were written by her enemies or their supporters. Roman historians portrayed her as a coward who fled at the first sign of difficulty, corrupting Antony into fleeing with her. But a more sympathetic reading suggests she made a calculated decision. The battle was stalemated, her ships had the ability to escape with the treasury intact, and preserving resources for future campaigns made strategic sense. When Antony followed her, that was his choice, not her fault. The children caught up in the aftermath faced particularly tragic fates. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, was hunted down and executed by Augustus's agents despite being only 17. He was killed not for anything he had done, but simply for being Caesar's potential heir. Cleopatra's other children by Antony, twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and young Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome and raised in Augustus's household alongside his own relatives. They grew up as wards of the man who had destroyed their parents, a psychologically complex situation that must have been deeply traumatic. Cleopatra Selene eventually married Juba II, king of Mauritania, and lived a relatively comfortable life as a client queen allied with Rome. She named her son Ptolemy, keeping alive the memory of her mother's dynasty. But she was the last of the Ptolemaic line to hold any real power, and even that power existed only at Rome's sufferance. The dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries ended not with glory but with children raised by their parents' destroyer. The archaeological evidence from Actium provides physical testimony to the battle that written sources sometimes obscure. In recent decades, underwater archaeologists have discovered bronze ship rams, pottery, and other artifacts in the waters off the Greek coast where the battle occurred. These finds confirm some details from ancient sources while raising new questions about others. The bronze rams found underwater are particularly revealing. They were massive pieces of military hardware, weighing hundreds of pounds, designed to punch holes in enemy hulls. The rams' decoration and inscriptions sometimes identify which ships they came from, providing direct physical evidence of specific vessels that fought at Actium. The rams' damage patterns show how they were used in combat. The dents, scrapes, and breaks tell stories of ships ramming each other or being rammed. What's particularly interesting is that many of the recovered rams come from large ships, suggesting that Antony's heavy vessels took severe losses. This aligns with written accounts of the battle, but provides independent archaeological confirmation. The physical evidence supports the narrative that Agrippa's tactics effectively neutralized the size advantage of Antony's fleet. The Victory Monument Augustus, constructed at Actium, still partially survives today. He built it on the spot where his camp had been located, overlooking the site of the battle. The monument originally displayed 35 to 36 bronze rams taken from captured or destroyed enemy ships, attached to the monument's walls as trophies. Most of these rams are now lost, but the monument's remains show how Augustus used architecture to commemorate and propagandize his victory. The monument's inscription made Augustus's political message clear. He had saved Rome from the threat of Eastern domination. Cleopatra was portrayed as the primary enemy, with Antony barely mentioned. This selective memory served Augustus's purposes. By minimizing Antony's role, Augustus could avoid emphasizing that the battle had been Roman against Roman. The monument turned a civil war into a patriotic victory over foreign enemies. Augustus also founded a city named Nicopolis, City of Victory, near the battle site, populating it with veterans and making it an administrative center for the region. The city thrived for centuries, a permanent reminder of Augustus's triumph. Today, its ruins include theaters, aqueducts, and city walls, testament to how completely Augustus dominated the region after his victory. In Egypt, the physical traces of Cleopatra's reign were systematically erased or appropriated. Temples that had shown Cleopatra as pharaoh alongside her son Caesarion were modified to remove or deface her images. The Ptolemaic administrative system was dismantled and replaced with Roman provincial government. Alexandria, which had been a royal capital, became merely another city in the Roman Empire, though still an important one. The erasure was never complete, however. Egyptian culture proved resilient, and many Egyptian religious traditions persisted under Roman rule. The cult of Isis, which Cleopatra had promoted and personally embodied, actually spread throughout the Roman Empire in the centuries after her death. In an ironic twist, the goddess Cleopatra had identified with became one of the most popular deities in Rome itself, worshipped by Romans who simultaneously celebrated Augustus's victory over the Egyptian queen. Modern historians studying Actium face the challenge of separating fact from propaganda. Almost all surviving literary sources were written by authors who benefited from Augustus's patronage or who lived under the empire he created. These sources had every reason to portray Augustus positively and his enemies negatively. Disentangling truth from spin requires careful analysis and skepticism. Archaeological evidence helps but has its own limitations. Physical remains can confirm that battles occurred and sometimes reveal tactical details, but they can't tell us about motivation, decision-making, or the complex political calculations that drove events. A bronze ship ram can prove a ship was sunk, but it can't explain why its captain made the decisions he made or what he was thinking in the moments before death. The challenge for historians is reconstructing what actually happened from sources that all have biases and limitations. Ancient historians like Plutarch, writing more than a century after Actium, tried to present balanced accounts, but even they relied on earlier sources that were colored by propaganda. Modern scholars attempt to read between the lines, noting where sources contradict each other or where their accounts seem suspiciously convenient for Augustus's reputation. Despite these challenges, the broad outline of what happened at Actium is clear. Agrippa commanded a fleet of smaller, more maneuverable ships equipped with innovative grappling weapons. He used superior tactics to neutralize Antony's advantage in ship size. Cleopatra's squadron fled, possibly by prearrangement, definitely with the treasury. Antony followed her, abandoning his fleet. The remaining ships fought bravely but were systematically overwhelmed. Augustus won total victory and went on to create the Roman Empire. The details remain debatable, but the significance is undeniable. Actium changed the world. The cultural legacy of Actium and Cleopatra extends far beyond ancient history into modern popular culture, literature, and art. No other ancient figure, except perhaps Jesus Christ and Julius Caesar, has been portrayed in as many films, plays, and novels as Cleopatra. Her story, especially its tragic conclusion following Actium, has captivated audiences for 2 millennia. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, written around 1606, established the template for how Western culture would remember the story. Shakespeare portrayed Antony as a great man destroyed by passion, torn between Roman duty and Egyptian love. Cleopatra appears as magnificent and terrible. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. The play made their romance legendary while also capturing the genuine political stakes of their conflict with Octavian. But Shakespeare's sources were Roman historians who viewed Cleopatra through the lens of Augustus's propaganda. The portrait of Cleopatra as primarily a seductress, as someone who won men through sexual wiles rather than political intelligence, comes directly from Roman attempts to discredit her. Modern scholarship has worked to recover a more complex picture of Cleopatra as an educated, multilingual ruler who navigated extraordinarily difficult political circumstances with considerable skill. The 1963 film, Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, became one of the most expensive movies ever made and captured public imagination partly because Taylor and Burton's real-life affair mirrored the Antony-Cleopatra relationship. The film's troubled production, massive budget overruns, director changes, intense media scrutiny of the star's romance, ironically paralleled the chaos and passion of the historical story it depicted. More recent portrayals have attempted more nuanced interpretations. Some modern adaptations emphasize Cleopatra's intelligence and political acumen rather than just her romantic relationships. Others explore the cultural clash between Egyptian and Roman civilizations, or the specifically gendered nature of the propaganda against Cleopatra, how Roman sources attacked her partly because she was a powerful woman exercising political authority. The feminist reclamation of Cleopatra's story has been particularly interesting. Rather than accepting the Roman narrative of a manipulative seductress, modern interpreters see a capable female ruler facing impossible odds in a male-dominated world. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony weren't mere sexual manipulation. They were rational strategies for protecting her kingdom through alliances with Rome's most powerful men. From this perspective, Cleopatra was neither victim nor villain but a pragmatic politician doing what she had to do to survive. The historical Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt and the last significant Hellenistic ruler. Her death marked the end of the era that began with Alexander the Great's conquests. The Hellenistic world, the fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures that Alexander's empire had created, was finally absorbed entirely into Rome. Cleopatra's attempt to maintain Egypt's independence and create a partnership with Rome rather than submission to it failed, but it was a bold attempt that almost succeeded. If we consider alternate scenarios, Cleopatra's strategy wasn't obviously doomed. If Antony had won at Actium, if he had killed Octavian in the subsequent campaign, if Cleopatra's diplomatic maneuvering had successfully split Octavian's supporters, any of these could have led to different outcomes. She wasn't foolish to try. She simply lost to an opponent who was better at both military logistics and political propaganda. The legend of Cleopatra's death, suicide by ASP, has particularly captured imagination. The image of the queen in royal regalia, allowing a sacred cobra to bite her, dying like a pharaoh should die, is immensely powerful. Whether it's precisely what happened, some scholars suggest she might have used poison rather than a snake. The symbolic truth overwhelms historical questions. Cleopatra controlled her death as she had controlled her life, refusing to be paraded through Rome in chains, denying Octavian his ultimate triumph. This final act of defiance, suicide as the ultimate assertion of autonomy, resonated through history. Cleopatra refused to be defined by her enemies' narratives. She would be a tragic queen who died by her own choice rather than a captive humiliated in Rome. The ASP, symbol of Egyptian royalty, transformed her death into a political and religious statement. She remained pharaoh to the end. The cultural fascination with Cleopatra reflects deeper themes. Her story raises questions about power, gender, cultural clash, the nature of love and duty, and the role of individuals in historical events. Was she a great ruler undone by circumstances beyond her control, or did her relationship with Antony represent a fatal flaw? The fact that we're still debating these questions 2,000 years later demonstrates the story's enduring power. Actium made this tragedy possible. The battle destroyed Cleopatra's hopes and sealed her fate, transforming a political struggle into the material of legend. The final assessment of Actium must balance multiple perspectives: military history, political transformation, technological innovation, and human tragedy. The battle succeeded not because of a single overwhelming advantage, but because Augustus and Agrippa effectively combined multiple smaller advantages into decisive victory. Militarily, Actium demonstrated principles that remain relevant today. Force multiplication, achieving superiority at the decisive point through concentration and maneuver rather than overall numerical advantage. The importance of logistics. Agrippa's blockade had weakened Antony's fleet before the battle even began. Morale as a force multiplier. Antony's troops were demoralized while Octavian's were confident. And leadership. Agrippa's tactical genius versus the confused command structure of Antony and Cleopatra's forces. The technological element, the Liburnian galley and Harpax weapon, was significant but not revolutionary. These were improvements on existing designs rather than breakthrough innovations. What made them decisive was how they were employed. Agrippa understood that naval battles weren't won by the biggest ships but by whoever could impose their tactical preferences on the enemy. His smaller ships could choose when and where to engage, negating Antony's advantage in ship size. This lesson about the relationship between technology and tactics echoes through military history. Advanced technology provides advantages, but victory ultimately depends on doctrine, training, leadership, and how effectively forces are employed. Antony had impressive ships, but Agrippa had a superior tactical system. The better system won. Politically, Actium was the culmination of decades of civil war and the death of the Roman Republic. The Republic had been undermined by numerous factors: territorial expansion beyond what republican institutions could effectively govern, wealth inequality, the rise of powerful individual generals commanding loyal armies, and the breakdown of traditional political norms. Actium didn't cause the Republic's death; it merely finalized a process that had been underway for generations. Augustus's genius was recognizing that he could create autocracy while maintaining republican forms. He didn't abolish the Senate or declare himself king. He simply accumulated so much personal power, military command, religious authority, political influence, that the traditional institutions became irrelevant. The Republic continued to exist formally even as imperial autocracy replaced it functionally. This template would influence authoritarian rulers for centuries, maintain democratic forms while concentrating actual power. The human cost of Actium extended far beyond the battle casualties. Thousands of soldiers died fighting or in the purges that followed. The civil wars had devastated Italy and the provinces economically. Families were torn apart by divided loyalties. The trauma of a generation of Romans who had known nothing but civil war shaped the early empire's culture, the desperate desire for peace and stability that made Augustus's autocracy acceptable. For Cleopatra and Antony personally, Actium represented the destruction of their dream of creating a new kind of empire, one that blended Roman military power with Eastern wealth and Egyptian cultural sophistication. It was an ambitious vision that might have created a very different ancient world. Instead, Rome would remain culturally and politically centered in the West, with eastern provinces subordinated rather than equal partners. The counterfactual question remains haunting. What if Antony and Cleopatra had won? Would their dual capital system have been stable? Would it have collapsed into renewed civil war between their children? Would Christianity have emerged differently in an empire partly centered in Alexandria? Would Roman culture have been more influenced by Egyptian and Greek traditions? These questions have no answers, but they remind us that Actium was a genuinely pivotal moment where history could have gone very differently. The legacy of Actium for Western civilization is profound. The Roman Empire that emerged from Western civilization is profound. The Roman Empire that emerged from Augustus's victory would last for centuries in the West and over a millennium in the East as Byzantium. Roman law, language, culture, and political concepts would shape medieval Europe and, through European colonization, much of the modern world. Christianity would spread through Roman infrastructure and eventually become the state religion. The empire's eventual division into eastern and western halves would create lasting cultural and religious divides in Europe. All of this flowed from the Battle of Actium. If Cleopatra's fleet had defeated Agrippa's, if Antony had killed Octavian, if Egypt had remained independent, the entire trajectory of Western civilization would have been different. Actium was one of those rare battles that genuinely changed everything. The secret weapon that destroyed Cleopatra's fleet wasn't really secret. It was visible to anyone watching. Smaller, faster ships using innovative tactics to defeat larger, more impressive vessels. The Liburnian galleys and Harpax weapons were clever applications of existing technology rather than revolutionary breakthroughs. But sometimes the simplest innovations, applied with genius, change history. Agrippa understood that naval battles aren't won by the most impressive ships but by whoever can impose their tactical will on the enemy. He built a fleet and developed tactics specifically designed to negate Antony's advantages and exploit his weaknesses. That understanding, combined with Augustus's political brilliance and the fatal decisions of Antony and Cleopatra, destroyed not just a fleet but a dream of a different kind of empire. The waters off Actium swallowed Cleopatra's purple-sailed ships, Egypt's independence, the last Hellenistic kingdom, and the last hope of stopping Augustus's rise to absolute power. The battle lasted only hours. The consequences lasted millennia. And the world changed forever because fast ships defeated slow ones on a September day in 31 BC.